Hi, this is Pastor Barry, back with the supplement video for Discipleship Essentials. This one is on Lesson 17, Love. Now, this lesson is fairly simple in terms of understanding the basic concept. I don't think you're going to get a lot of pushback from people on the subject of love. It's something that we all buy into, and especially those of us who are believers think that love is a good thing and want to live that way. And so the real challenge is not about getting people's buy-in or their understanding. It's really a challenge to live it out. And that's where I think it's important that your group have some serious discussion and planning around this idea of how do we do this. So let's jump into it. The core truth for this week is that sacrificial love, as exemplified in Jesus' voluntary death on the cross, is to be reflected in the way that Christians relate to each other. This kind of love is so out of step with the world's way that believers will take notice. Now, I don't think Ogden is saying that it won't take any explanation on your part. Some of this love that St. Francis of Assisi quote that we are to preach at all times and to use words when necessary. But I've said before and I'll say again, words are almost always necessary. People don't know why you do the things that you do. And they need an explanation of why. They need to know that it has something to do with Jesus. However, it's super important that our love be reflected in concrete actions out in the world, that people be able to see us and know that something supernatural is going on in our lives. And they will often see that when we are willing to lay down our lives for them in love. Now, a couple of key words or phrases that I focused in on this core truth. One was sacrificial love. And the reason I like that phrase is because it reminds us that love is not just a feeling. I think love is a feeling. It's more than just a commitment. If my wife said that she was really committed to my good, but that she wasn't really attracted to me or didn't feel affection toward me, I would be worried. So the feeling matters, but the kind of love that Ogden is talking about here is more than just the feeling. It's the willingness to give up oneself for the sake of somebody else's good. So this is a sacrificial love. The other phrase or word that I picked up in this core truth was voluntary. So in other words, this is a chosen path. It's not something that we do because we're being forced into it. It's not something that we've been threatened by God to have to do. It is in imitation of and in faith in Jesus. We live the way that he lived. The way that I rephrased this was that the true mark of a Christian is a loving, cross-shaped life or cruciform life, a life that looks like what Jesus did on the cross. The question that this core truth raised for me was, what do we make of Christians who are not marked by this lifestyle of loving sacrifice? Lots and lots of people in the United States call themselves Bible-believing, born-again Christians, but they don't live anything like Jesus. And so I had this question about what does it mean if someone claims to be a Christian, but their life isn't reflecting this sort of loving sacrifice of Jesus. I think what it means is that maybe being a Christian is not what they think it means. So if we look at our lives and we find that we don't have loving sacrifice, I think we have to ask ourselves, are we really following the one who lived this way? All right, let's talk about the memory verse guide. For the second week in a row, I think that in some ways it may be easier if you're picking either the memory verse guide or the inductive Bible study guide to go with the memory verse guide. Now you can do either one. These are both great passages, John 13 or John 17. John 13, though, is more of a narrative passage. It's a story about Jesus' last night with his disciples and what happened there. So I just think story is a bit more accessible. John 17 is Jesus' great prayer for his disciples. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's just a lot of words. John chapter 13. The first question, I think, is an important one, which is the question about context. How does foot washing and the prediction of betrayal provide context for this command to love one another as he has loved us? This is all in John chapter 13. And, you know, if you think about the fact that Jesus knew that he was about to die, what would be on his mind? Well, mostly what's on his mind is loving and serving them. If you think about the fact that Jesus knew that one of his really close friends, somebody that he had been traveling and hanging with for the last 3 years, was about to betray him, and the emotions that would come with that, and the desire to confront that and see the person turn or whatever, the fact that he is willing to lay all of that aside and to take up a towel and to wash his disciples' feet, which was the lowest form of service, or one of the very low forms of service. The lowest servant in the house generally washed people's feet because it was a dirty, smelly job that nobody wanted. And I believe that foot washing demonstrates the lengths to which Jesus will lower himself to love, well, to love them and to love us. You know, that prediction of betrayal highlights the fact that even though Jesus knew that one of his close friends would turn on him, that he was still willing to love and serve him willingly. You realize Jesus washed Judas's feet as well. And what was that like for him? And what was it like for Judas to have his feet washed by Jesus, knowing that, you know, in a few short hours he was going to turn Jesus in? Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples, when you have love for one another." So it's, you know, it's a super important command, because it is the way that people will know that we belong to Jesus, that we follow him, is when we show this kind of sacrificial love toward one another. And that's part of what I think Ogden is getting at in that third question about the word "as" and how it affects the meaning of the phrase. When we say that we are to, Jesus says, "As I have loved you, so you must love one another," he is saying that the model for love is the way that he loved us. And so we can't get away with just saying that we have a warm feeling towards someone, or we just really care about them, or we're just going to give them gifts, because that's not all Jesus did. Jesus laid aside his privilege and position. He laid aside his rights. He even laid aside his life to bless us. And so that's the kind of love that we need to have for people. Ogden asks the question, I think it's the fourth question in the memory verse study guide: why is love the authenticating sign to the world that we are disciples of Jesus? And Jesus doesn't actually explain why in this passage. He just says that people will recognize us as his disciples when we love one another. But you have to wonder if it's because Jesus is the one that looks like this. And so when we look like this, when we are willing to lay down our privileges and our rights for the sake of blessing others, then we look like him and we get associated with him. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the inductive Bible study guide. I'm going to say a couple of things about this. One, if you would rather not do the John 13 passage and you still are interested in an inductive Bible study, one possibility to look at would be Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, which talks about, 5 through 13 talks about how Jesus gave the example of what it looks like to lay down your life in love for someone. So that would be an interesting passage to take on. As I think about it now, I'm not really sure that it's any easier than John 17. But one advantage that it might have over John 17 is that John 17 introduces a second issue. In John 13, we were talking about love and about sacrificial love. And that's exactly what Philippians 2 demonstrates. John 17 talks about unity. And unity and love are obviously closely related, but they are different issues, or yeah, I think they're distinguishable issues. You can decide how your group wants to handle that. The essential thing in this passage is that our oneness in relationship with one another is modeled on the oneness that God has within himself. The members of the Trinity laying down their lives for one another in love, uh, mutually submitted to one another, yielding to one another, honoring one another. This is what unity looks like. And again, it's modeled on who God is. It's one of the ways that we are to image God in the world. It's not just that I image God, it's that I, and in the relationships that I have with all of you, are to image uh, God in the world, in the way that he cooperates and shares a single purpose and like does the mutual honoring thing. So, one personal question from this inductive Bible study guide is the question, in what current relationship do you need to experience reconciliation? And I just want to encourage you to help each other to be honest about that, to name names, to speak honestly about where things are at, and to get prayer if things are not in a good place. A reconciliation may take more than a single conversation, but I think it is worth pursuing. And I've had a variety of broken relationships from my past, and I have tried to go back and make all of them right. To go back and to ask for forgiveness when I've needed to try to work it out with people. And as I say that, I recognize that there are some relationships in my life that are probably not where God would want them to be yet. It's not that I haven't made an attempt on them, but it is that maybe it's time to make another attempt. So, uh, at the ending of our church plant, the bridge, there were a lot of hard things that got said, and a lot of relationships that got, if not broken, then certainly bruised. And it's been a couple of years. I think things have healed up somewhat, but it's probably worth going back to try to see if some of those relationships can't sort of be made even more whole, because there's probably still some awkwardness there. So if you watch the video, maybe you can come and check with me to see if I've made any progress on that front. Okay, the reading study guide, God Works Everything Together for Good. I think this is actually fairly straightforward. Much of it is based on that passage from the memory verse guide, John chapter 13. One question that he asks in that reading study guide that he doesn't ask in the memory verse guide is, how does foot washing foreshadow the cross? I don't know if everybody knows that the foot washing actually does foreshadow the cross in at least a couple of ways. So one way it does it is by Jesus's self-lowering, his willingness to allow himself to be degraded that we might get blessed. And so it happens when he washes their feet, and it happens big time when he's on the cross, which was the worst kind of, most shameful, humiliating kind of death. It also is a picture of cleansing, of washing off the dirt. And, again, in the foot washing that happens literally on the cross, it's happening in a spiritual way, that Jesus is enduring what he's enduring, that we might be made clean. Again, I think when you're reading the essay, it's very important to try to get personal, to think about what does it mean for your life, and to share as honestly and openly as you can, and to help other people in your group to do that as well. He asks the question, where do you need to grow in servant love? And you could look back at the question before, do you need to have eyes to see, eyes that will look and find the need, find the opportunity to be helpful? Do you need to focus on the needs of others above focusing on your own needs? Or do you need to learn self-sacrifice? And many of us are willing to serve. We just don't want to serve until it hurts. We don't want to serve until it really costs us something. And Ogden says that servanthood is death to the self. And it's important for us to acknowledge that that kind of sacrifice is contrary to our natural nature. It's something that God has to produce in us, something that makes us a little bit more like Him. Now, what are some ways that you could tackle application in your group? Well, some people might consider a literal foot washing ceremony. You'd get a little tub that you could get people's feet into, have people take off their shoes and socks and actually wash each other's feet and dry them with a towel. I've done this kind of thing before. It's intimate. It's a little embarrassing to me, which is part of the power of it, is what it is like to be served and to serve in such an intimate way. So there's something very good about that. But I also wonder if there doesn't need to be some way to do concrete acts of love that are represented by foot washing, but do them outside of your group, to do something that will bless people outside the group. I heard that 2911 was doing a child care night so that young couples could have a date. That's a fabulous way to make a sacrifice of yourself in a way that will love someone else and bless them. You might serve a meal to someone when people do the Lord's table. That's a great time to take a night to honor and bless somebody else. And you can do it not just by giving them food, but by taking time with them, looking them in the eye, introducing yourself, finding out a little bit about them. You can do it in small ways by bringing food to a class. That it's not required to bring it, you're just doing it to bless other people. But the bottom line is, you want to find some concrete way to actually do these things. Remember that you are in the middle of the third unit of Discipleship Essentials, which is on becoming like Jesus. And we will never become like Jesus until we learn to lay down our lives in some tangible way. So help each other to do that, encourage each other, challenge each other, and have a great week in your walk with Jesus.